Um, I have up on the slide two different forms of culture. You have material culture, materialism, everything that's around us, your physical house, um, that helps produce a culture. Um, your food, how we eat. Um, um, so those are the physicality of culture. Then there's the signs and the internal production of, so your physicality and what we do for a living and how we live physically creates meaning, or we find meaning in what we do. So there's meaning, there's signs of beliefs, um, that creates an internal reality for what we're doing. So this world of internal and external, um, they both are associated with your with your culture. So culture is a integrative dynamic. So excuse me, if you change one aspect of a culture, for example, if the divorce rate increases like it did during the post-World War II era and into the 1960s and into present day, divorce went up. Well, why did divorce go up? That was part of our cultural shift. Well, what was happening was women were starting to become more independent economically. So economics was changing. They started to work in the workplace during World War II and World War One because the men were off to war, so the women went to work. Well, um, yeah, there you go. You have one economic demand that requires women to go to work, and that leads to actually a complete transformation of the family that we see today, where men are. It's a two-person working two-worker household typically. It's men are staying home now, and women go to work. So it's integrated. It's integrated. Culture is integrated. You change one aspect, and it can completely have the impact of trickling and changing the entire system. Culture is an adaptation to nature. We are now that we are not necessarily dependent upon um, uh, well, we actually I just had this real loud boom upstairs, and hoping that everything's okay. My roof kind of was shaking. Anyway, yeah, we have culture now has overtaken our environment such that it's not necessarily adapting to our environment anymore. It's our environment is adapting to our culture, but historically and prehistorically, we've always been using culture to survive. Clothes and the type of clothes we're wearing, that's part of our culture. Um, and that is something that is obviously an adaptation to the climate. So one thing we do in anthropology and cultural anthropology is we compare cultures. And when we compare cultures, we realize that there is no universal truths to how to live, and so humans like to rank and say this is the way you're supposed to 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 perform your life, and we often create what we call ethnocentric values to our own culture. We'll come back to that in chapter 2. But comparing cultures, you realize there is no universal truth. Um, Please stop me if there's any questions. Um, so on the cultural side, another um, approach to culture is language. When I ask the question of what is culture, some people sometimes always say it's language, and yeah, language is culture, culture is language. So what is really fascinating about language, excuse me, is that what's really fascinating about language is that you have both a vehicle for culture and a reflection of what culture is. Language is used to um, to teach culture to the next generation. It is a vehicle to explain it, and but also the content of the language itself um, is very has a cultural flair, right? It has a um, it is you look at Latin cultures and how the language of Latin people, um, Latin-based, Latin-rooted people, how that reflects their food, or how it has a relationship to their relationships and their family and their what they do for a living. There's this sort of interplay of language to the larger culture and the clothes, the style. Um, so it's fascinating. So you can approach language in from many different angles. It's a very vast subject. But one of the angles is structure. Um, Language in a way is organized almost mathematically, and it allows for in a sense, a universal approach to language, and you can break down the components of language. And those that do often say that language, that we all have something as far as all the different cultures, all the different languages can be broken down into this prototype language that is the roots to all language. And there's a lot of debate about that, but the structural units of language is, like I said, it's almost mathematical. And for me, when I was studying it in my PhD program, I really found it very dry, and it took the life out of language to me. And I you literally well, it's for the, it's just my brain type. It's just what I prefer, what I do not prefer. Um, so another approach is social context and how language has changed from group to group to group. So if you look at in American English, and you have you got 27 different dialect systems have been diagnosed by linguists in the United States, and you can travel around the region of the country and you can pinpoint those dialects. That's one type of grouping. Geographical location. I traveled in Italy and went from village to village in the south in Calabria at some point, and from village to village to village, their dialects changed. So that's one dynamic of change, but also you yourself. When you get up in the morning, you go and you talk to your family, then you go to your school, then when you go to hang out with friends, go to your job, your language changes based upon your own relationships. So that's another sort of orientation towards how languages differ from another. Um, you know, One of the from an ethnic orientation, we have what's called Ebonics. Um, and as far as in cultural anthropology, we go a little bit deeper into this, but Ebonics is thought to be, for some people, a fabricated system, um, and not necessarily a real dialect. But the fact of the matter is that Ebonics to American English is as much of a dialect as Italian is to Latin. Um, so it is got its own system. Again, it's a social group, has its own orientation to a particular language. How do languages change over time? This is another fascinating exploration of language, and looking at how over the thousands of years. Of course, we have only 5,000 years of written language, so it's and we can't hear people from 1,000 years ago. But however, you can look at present day languages and also look at the groups that speak those languages, and see how as those groups traveled around the world, you connect this to their biology and their genetics. and you can see how they're traveling and how they dispersed their genes as the group migrated, but also how their language was shared as they migrated. So it influences their language as they traveled, the influence on them, and they influenced others, and that is manifested in their language. So the changing of languages is something that is another approach from a linguistic anthropology. Any questions about this? Right. Oh, here's an example. Sorry. Yes, I forgot I had this up here. We have the Native Americans. So we'll talk about this in chapter 12 a little bit, but there was a first migration over into the Americas, um, happened over the Bering Strait, and one group, Asian group that traveled over, dispersed, and there were multiple migrations, but that was the first primary migration that populated the continent. And so from one group of people, you have one proto language that changed over the continent. Another example. So there's a interesting little rivalry between archaeology and historians. It's not serious, but there is a rivalry in academia that is friendly. Historians are driven by the written word, right? It is you have 5,000 years of history, and it is definitely something that historians rely upon, reading those texts and interpreting. Well, archaeologists, on the other hand, say, well, we actually rely upon artifacts and evidence. They're detectives of artifacts. So they ask the question of, yes, you got your written text, but who wrote it? And if you just go back a couple hundred years ago, or even 100 years ago, who could write and who could read? Um, it typically, of course, it is more well-to-do and those that have the resources to be able to school themselves or to go to school and learn. So the written record is littered with what we call ethnocentrism and putting one's own self in the center of the story they're telling. So archaeologists say, we got evidence, and we've got a real a more I guess truthful account or less biased account of reality from years and centuries ago. Um, so it's all interpretation, though. There's interpretation that happens in archaeology, just like there's interpretations happening in history as well. And interpretations are inherently biased. So archaeologists aren't perfect in that realm as well. Um, so artifacts. This is what archaeologists most focus upon. And when we talk about artifacts, they ask the question. They find one artifact and they ask the question of, what is this? What is this thing? What is this? Maybe it's an arrowhead. And where was it found? One of the fundamental rules in archaeology is whenever you find something, you don't move it, and you want to preserve the location and dig out around it and find others and find that relationship to a story. And it's they're always trying to dig down into the ground in order to uncover and unveil a culture. So culture anthropologists are looking at, we like to look at old cultures that have died, but primarily what our focus on is studying cultures today. Archaeologists are about uncovering cultures of yesterday, and they do so by telling stories and interpreting artifacts. A skeleton itself, okay, is you got this 5,000-year-old skeleton. Well, how where it's found and its location and artifacts around it are going to tell you something about the story. But the content of it's the skeleton. And is there is it a skeleton that shows that this person was diseased? Um, well, you know, you find a disease, you find a maimed person that was 40 years old, and the might have suffered some sort of injury, but continued to live. So there's a story there. And Neanderthals, for example, Neanderthals have the kind of injuries that you would find in a rodeo worker, because they were working and hunting animals that were dangerous, and they were having to kill them up close. They didn't have long-range weaponry, so you know, their skeleton remains show that they were injured pretty regularly. And it says something about their culture. It says something about who they were, and it contrasts with modern human skeletons, where those injuries are less because our weaponry allowed us to kill animals from a distance. Anyway, skeletal remains. This is, but the what is said to be the gold mine of archaeology is to find waste, is to find the garbage dump. What do you think future archaeologists of future times, say, hopefully we'll be around in 1,000 years. What do you think an archaeologist would think of our waste dumps today? What would they
Would
assume?
be horrible.
Or
Well,
very wasteful.
Very
we're
wasteful.
we're very I guess it would say it would show a timeline from the industrial time when things were mass produced, and then it would also show, I'm assuming it's going to show how much consumption we were able to acquire.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. We're a consumer culture, right? So they are definitely going to read into our waste to realize we bought a lot of shit. Excuse my language, but it's a reality. Anybody else? What about, I mean, how things are made? You know, it's like you think about the, so you hear this, but it's really, there's a lot of truth to this. I've lived long enough to see this, how they make things like a toaster oven today versus 25 years ago. Things are made today to break. It really seems to be they're made to break. Um, and so there, you know, it's wasteful, yes. And we have you know, a fast food culture in which we need to have first off, we need to have it fast and accessible, but we also need to have the newest model. So we throw away things that are actually still working. So yeah, it's, I think, going down that rabbit hole of our waste. I think that it's yeah. Nancy says it's. I think things are made to break easier because it will encourage consumption. So one thing that we will look at in cultural anthropology is definitely our consumer culture is driven by our economics, and for a business to thrive, it has to have demand. So if you don't have demand, then your business dies. So you create demand by creating products that aren't going to last, or they'll have a new version in 2 years, so that there's an improved model. Again, I think the cell phones. The cell phones and the computers are what's going to be found, I think, the most. Anyway, so human waste, fascinating sort of rabbit hole we could go down. And that's archaeology for you. So applied anthropology. So these four fields that we just covered: biological, um, cultural, linguistics, and archaeology. All four of them have um, a real world value. So we have the academic study, that we're engaging in this semester. But then you have the how are you going to get a job with this discipline? This is one of the I have students ask me this all the time who are interested in anthropology. What can I do with it? Well, there is definitely jobs out there, but you have to be creative. You need to be creative to to apply your academic world. There are ways to directly go out and get a job as a quote unquote anthropologist, but a lot of anthropologists, they use their knowledge to apply it in society to help solve problems, and they fill a demand. There's that consumer dynamic demand, a demand in society based upon something that is really causing businesses, organizations, governments, individuals a problem. So applied is something that is interwoven in all four of these fields, but applied is also kind of thought to be its own field now. But the thing about it is it would not be a field if you didn't have the other four. So it's always dependent upon the other four fields. So it sort of stands alone, but it doesn't stand alone. And so biological anthropology, what's the since this is the subject of our course, I'll show this one little clip. But any hint on what a biological anthropologist their focus is? What would be an applied form of biological anthropologist? I'm sorry, that's a better way to state it. Well, let me show you a quick clip of a biological anthropologist.
Showcase how anthropologists are tackling the world's most pressing problems and making remarkable contributions to human understanding.
Can y'all hear that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Death doesn't happen 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. It happens all the time. A lot of the times, the phone will ring and I'm dead asleep. They'll tell me, it's a 35-year-old with a single gunshot wound to the head, and there's a note on the scene, so it's probably a suicide. I'm a death investigator and a forensic anthropologist. Forensics is anything relating the law and science together. So when we apply the law to anthropology, that basically means we're using our knowledge of human osteology and kind of applying that to the law. The purpose of a medical examiner's office is to determine cause and manner of death. It's my job when I go out to the scene and when I'm asking questions on the phone of family members, doctors, law enforcement. It's basically to rule out everything else. And I do that with the specific questions that I ask. And this is where kind of the anthropology training comes into play. So I'm going to ask cops specific questions and look for specific answers. Whereas with the families, they just lost a loved one, so you have to change your tone. You have to change the language that you're using when you're speaking to them. I've always wanted to do more of the forensic science side than be a professor of anthropology or work kind of in a traditional anthropology role. I was a researcher for the World War II Directorate, and we went back and recreated the last known whereabouts and the circumstances of the loss of folks from World War II service personnel. One of the very first Battle of the Bulge fights, they took some shots from the German soldiers. The boat went down. They couldn't positively identify this gentleman. His name is Private Bain. So they buried him as an unknown, and there he stayed for 60 years. Being trained in forensic anthropology, I went back in his records and was able to kind of recreate everything. And they had made a mistake. His dental report said that he was missing one of his molars. But the original, when he first entered the Army, they had said that he was missing a different molar. Doing that identification with Bain was kind of just a touch and a taste of using what I know to provide closure to a family, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. The good thing about an anthropology degree, it provides you with kind of this broad overview of human beings. People are scared of death. In the United States, we are so reverent. A lot of the times we ignore it. And that's a very American thing to do, right? Just ignore it and it'll go away. But everyone dies, and I think it's important to find out why and what happened. It's respectful to the person and to their family so they know. I do this job because it's the worst day of people's lives, and I can do it. Somebody has to help these families and figure out why their loved one is deceased. I'm glad to do it, and it encompasses all the things that I love to do.
So, biological anthropologist, this is, I think, a lot of people come to both my field of anthropology and criminal justice looking, oops, sorry. Come to this field looking for the pathway into forensics, and definitely biological anthropology is one avenue. I always say that if you want to go that direction, you want to get a grounding in the physical sciences. In fact, most people will say that you're better off starting in the physical sciences and then getting a second degree or a minor in anthropology. Yeah, any questions about that? This is, again, it's applied. It's outside of the academic realm, and it is dealing with a problem, to say the least. Forensics deals with a crime scene, just like a forensics would deal with a 10,000, 15,000 year skeleton that's found by an archaeologist. So this is, you could say, the same technology and the same knowledge applied in a different context. Also, biological anthropologists are definitely involved with preservation of the extinction of primate species. That's a definite problem, which we'll cover in the next unit. So that's how that's one aspect, or a couple examples of how biological anthropology is applied. Let's look at linguistics. And, it is, again, it's a pretty academic-driven discipline. A lot of anthropologists teach in universities and colleges, like myself. That's really how a lot of us make a living. But linguistic anthropologists are involved in many different avenues towards applying their discipline. One of which is working with indigenous populations to help them preserve their languages. There's a lot of dying languages that are happening right now, and there's nobody teaching those languages to the next generation, or writing those languages down, or actually interpreting documents of education for people who speak different languages. So linguistics anthropologists are involved in that kind of stuff. They're also involved in helping write standardized exams. We have a horrible history of exams being written by upper class white men that are Ivy League educated, have no idea of the culture and the population that they're writing these exams for. So we are evolving and creating standardizations that are trying to be more culturally relative to the people who are taking them. Culturally, cultural anthropology is got many avenues for application. We work for a lot of nonprofits, and so these nonprofits are not called cultural anthropology. They are of all kinds of directions towards problems, whether it be healthcare, education. Um, you know, one of the things that cultural anthropologists really can kind of their go-to is to work with the to work with. I lost my train of thought for a second there. Sorry. Just got a text and I'm sort of distraction. You know, it's technology. They work to actually help resolve conflict between groups. So if a company is having a problem with a local government, anthropologists will be called in to try to create a bridge, so to speak, to help facilitate conflict resolution between organizations. But they also go in and help internally help organizations understand themselves. These large corporations hire anthropologists to do such things. Um, Corporations also hire anthropologists to help market their products to populations. So if you want to get to know a culture so that you can make a bigger profit from your product, anthropologists are there for you. So yes, that is you know, it's pretty wide ranging as far as what cultural anthropologists will do. But again, you have to know your niche and know what direction you want to take yourself, what your interests are. I thought as a cultural anthropologist I would be involved, because of my studies in prisons. I thought I would be involved with helping formulate new penal policy and prisons that are more progressive. I'm here. I teach anthropology and criminal justice, so I feel like I brought it all together. But yeah, I mean, this is something that you kind of have to make it up as you go along, and you got to believe in yourself. Um, Archaeologists. What do archaeologists do? Well, one of the primary avenues for applying archaeology is what we call CRM, Cultural Resource Management. So when they are getting ready to build a building well, like they did at UTC, but all across the city now here, especially around Chattanooga, where there's a strong presence of archaeological potential because of our relationship to the Cherokees and the history and prehistory of the Cherokees here. So you might ever had a chance to go down to Moccasin Bend and walk those. There's two trails down there. One trail is a prehistoric area where you got a possibly potentially like 12,000 years of prehistory right there, very much a part of the Cherokee legacy. But also, you can fast forward, it's also related to the Civil War and that area, and it was a very, very important location right there on the river for the Union Army. So yeah, it's a fascinating. It's got some plaques and things, you know, for you to read. It's quite an awesome. They're in the middle of actually renovating it and bringing it into a very modern park. I think they're going to move the gun range down there, which I'll be happy to, because all you hear is gunfire from the police gun range down there. Anyway, archaeologists, they go in and they make sure that there are no artifacts for new construction or new buildings. The Riverwalk is another example. They had to have archaeologists out as they were building the Riverwalk. Any questions about that? Any questions about applied anthropology? Okay, so we are at the end of this chapter, and we do not have enough time to start the next chapter, but do have time just to actually let's look at this. We have enough time to look at this final video. I think this clip. I apologize, Samantha. You're getting some of the same stuff that you got yesterday from our culture anthropology course, but this chapter is basically the same as what I teach for my culture anthropologies, but from here on, the two disciplines diverge as far as the class goes. So let me get fast forward.
Case how anthropologists are tackling the world's most pressing problems and making remarkable contributions to human understanding.
Being surprised by what we find is something that occurs fairly regularly. At the World Trade Center site, we were expecting to find large timber landfill retaining devices used as Manhattan built out further and further into the Hudson River. One of my colleagues picked up a large curved timber and was looking at it, and she thought it might be part of a ship. It didn't look anything like the other things we were finding. The excavation crew helped us remove some of the thick layers of mud from around where we thought this came from, and you very quickly saw the spines of a ship. Archaeology is anthropology, or it isn't anything. It's the study of human activity and human culture using a different suite of methodologies and skills. My name is Michael Papalardo, and I'm an archaeologist. AKRF is an environmental planning and engineering firm. My role as part of the Culture Resource Group is to look at the impacts of projects on archaeological resources. As an archaeologist, I'm not looking at in the yards of important people or the sites of important historic events. I'm looking more at the day-to-day remains of people that there might not be books written about them at all. It gives us an opportunity to understand what communities were like. So there's a former bus depot. It's an entire city block in East Harlem. This site was the location of a cemetery that was established in the late 1600s. And the cemetery was abandoned and destroyed, and then they rebuilt the site over time. So the city, in planning to reuse this block, they hired us to do an archaeological survey of the site. Is there a cemetery still there? Are there any human remains? What's the sensitivity of it archaeologically? During the course of the work, we did find human remains in one of the trenches, and that kind of changed everything. Now we know that we had human remains. The human remains turned out to be disarticulated. There wasn't an actual burial situation where you picture a body in a cemetery. The task force visited the site within the hour after finding a human skull, and it was an incredibly emotional experience for them because this task force had been kind of in existence for almost 10 years at that point, trying to steer redevelopment of the site in a sensitive manner given its important and long history. So finding it kind of made us feel part of that process. It tied us in more with the important and emotional feeling that they were having, seeing the actual remains in place. Through gaining a better understanding of our past, it brings a better integration of communities today.
All right, archaeology in action. I gotta ask Gabby, what does your dad do at Moccasin Bend?
He's the lawyer there for the state.
I'm sorry, say that again?
He's the lawyer there.
Okay.
Yeah.
For the state, you said?
Yeah, he's the lawyer for the state of Tennessee, and he represents the mental health patients there.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. I gotcha. Which is really near where the hospital is pretty close to where, of course, I'm talking about. It's quite a site there. Well, that's all I've got for you today, this week. If there's any
I have a
question?
question.
Sure.
I'm sorry. I was looking up that site that you were talking about, the Moccasin Bend, and I noticed there's a Moccasin Bend National Archaeological District. What exactly is that? Like,
That's it. That is it.
that's the actual. Okay,
Yep.
that's what you're referring to. Okay.
Yes, they've made it That they've been on WTC, NPR. They've been doing a lot of shows highlighting the park and how it came to be a national park. It's really, yeah, it's really quite fascinating. And that they're going to build a welcoming center there. There's 2 trails now, but I think they're going to build out more trails. Of course, it's around the golf course right in that area. The Blues Blaze Trail, yeah, that's really nice. Gabby says. There's 2, and I forget what the other blaze is. It white? There's another blaze trail that is. There's one that's a loop, and there's one that you go to the river and it's a straight shot and come back. But it's the one that goes to the river is the one that I'm talking about. That's got the archaeological site. Yeah, they said that one of the problems they found was that there was lots of when they a few years ago, a couple decades ago, when they first started to develop this into an archaeological national recognized area, so they found a lot of holes, and people had gone down and dug little kind of people who were interested in looting the native culture and their archaeological remains. And so if you go walking through there, you got to be careful, evidently, because there are definitely still holes from people's digging. So yeah, that's something a little bit sort of. They're trying to make it sort of because the park is right across from the city, and it's got the potential to be something that's really beautiful. And I think that's what they're going to try to control the development so that it's done in a nice way. So because it can be done. Yeah, Nancy.
So do you park right in there, and then from there there's trails, or?
No, you have to kind of look. In fact, you can look online and look up the Blue Blaze Trail, Moccasin Blue Blaze Trail, and you kind of have to dig down. It's not well publicized. There are there's 2 different parking, and because they're separated, the trails aren't right next to each other. You kind of have to. There's a little bit of a drive from each other actually. So, but there's little parking lots at the trailhead. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, good to know, because that'll be something nice to do.
Yeah, it's no kidding.
Okay.
It's a nice walk.
All right. Okay, that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So y'all have a great weekend. I will see you on Monday, and thank you for your time, and thanks for going a little long on a Friday.
Thank
Have a
you.
good weekend.
Have a good weekend.
All right. Enjoy the sunshine. Hey.